good to see you all, especially given the conditions outside. We're glad to see you. It's a good group of you that have shown up. We appreciate it. Those of you who may be visiting with us, I'm Bill Peterson, pastor here, and we welcome you today as we gather. We will take a break. Andy will take a break at some point, and we'll go out in the narthex and walk around for about 10 minutes and come back in at the end of that. Andy can give you instructions, but we do have some decaf coffee out there on the bar in the kitchen. Restrooms are behind you back there. Just go past the bar in the kitchen and you'll see them back there behind you. We are delighted that you're here. I wanted to, of course you all know this is about beer and wine, so I wanted to take a moment to let you know that Andy is going to be lecturing again, giving a presentation again on 2 successive Wednesdays here in the sanctuary. It's August 14th and the 21st. And those 2 presentations are going to be on a topic that is entitled How Judaism, Christianity, and Pagan Religions Lived Together in Ancient Syria. There is an ancient city on the Euphrates, Dur-Europus, that was destroyed in the middle of the 3rd century, in the 250s. Was it by the Parthians or someone? The Greeks, somebody got it. It was a wall was literally pushed over the top of it, and everything under that wall, Andy says, was preserved for millenniums. Everything on top of the wall, of course, was subject to human as well as the weather degradation and things of that nature. Under that wall is an amazing find that Yale archaeologists found in the 1930s, and Andy will have a visual presentation of Dur-Europus for us showing what was found there. It will show ancient synagogues as well as churches side by side, and pagan religion rituals and temples and things. And so we hope that you'll come for that. That is Wednesday, October 14th and 21st here in the sanctuary at 10 a.m. And we'll get more information out about that. August, excuse me. Got to keep an eye on me for sure. Most of you know Andy, I think, quite well. I was sitting here, Andy, I was thinking this morning coming in, 40 years. I started in September of 1984. You had hair then, and yeah, and it's unbelievable. That's right, already thinning, but you had hair. For 40 years, I've known Andy Dearman. He taught intro into Old Testament and also taught me Hebrew exegesis at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He's an honorably retired minister from of the Presbyterian Church USA. His undergraduate is at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, my daughter's alma mater. Yeah, there you go Hills. He holds a Master's of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, and his PhD is from Emory in Atlanta. He began his teaching career at Louisiana State University, LSU, and then quickly came over to Austin Seminary, where he served from 1982 to 2009. Both on the faculty as well as several years serving as 9 years serving as dean, I think, or at least more than that. 6. Felt like 9, didn't it? Yeah. He is a recognized authority internationally on ancient Israel, its culture and religion. He's an author, editor, contributor to several books, biblical commentaries, study Bibles, and has served on the editorial boards of biblical translations and academic periodicals. And most importantly, he has participated in archaeological projects all over the Fertile Crescent in Israel and Jordan, and served 1 term on the governing board of the American Center for Oriental Research in Amman, Jordan. Andy, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Thank you very much. Am I on? Yep. Okay, good. I hope you will enjoy what I'm about to present today. If you do, it's because Bill chose the topic. And if it doesn't go very well, you can blame me, not Bill. So I will say just 30 seconds as an advertisement for August. Sudden destruction is awful for the people who experience it. When that happens in certain ways, you know, the history and culture of that time period, take Pompeii, for example. You've got a snapshot in time of what a bustling city was like. Think of all of the marvelous things that have come out of Pompeii. This city that Bill mentioned, Dura Europos, is on a bend of the Euphrates. It's out in the middle of nowhere. But for a while, it was a great city, and it has world-class remains. The earliest, probably the earliest house church that survives. Excuse me. A synagogue with unparalleled paintings, Mithraeum temples, and so I'll have some good pictures. If you're interested in that kind of thing, I'll have that for the 14th week. Was that 30 seconds? Is that about right? Okay. We're not timing. Oh, okay. So, friends, this is a two-fisted presentation. I've got a pointer in one hand and an advancer in the other. And let's just make sure I get it right. Okay. So, wine and fermented beverages. I have a quote there from Psalm 104. It's pretty straightforward. It praises God for the great things of created order. Wine, oil, and bread. And if you just will pause with me and think about it for a moment, what I want to say to you is all three of those things are staples, absolutely central to the Eastern Mediterranean, sometimes called the Levant, the biblical world. And each of them also contribute to a religious understanding of that part of the world and of the Old and New Testaments. And you will immediately know that if you just think about it for a moment. So today we'll talk about wine and fermented beverages, a little bit about oil, and some about grain. But they are central. And I'm going to stop with comments once we get to about the 8th century of the Common Era, because at that point, you know, we have a tremendous change in the political governance of the region with the takeover of Islamic civilization. And because it forbids the use of fermented beverages, then the drinking and the production and so forth begin to, shall I say it, dry up. And so for centuries, that industry was in a decline until the beginning of the 20th century. Now it has come back in the region. But I won't have much to say about that. But I will say that Lebanon and Israel and Jordan now have developed more of their winemaking than they have for centuries. Okay, if you can read along, great. I'll just make some comments. I won't read this to you. But let me start with that first bullet point as you're looking at it, and to say that one of the things that has been most interesting to me, because as a person who's interested in history and culture, it's the written sources and the archaeology that I'm most familiar with, but work in the laboratory has really picked up steam in the last 10 or 15 years. And so I'm trying to learn by the seat of my pants in reading about the quite detailed analysis of wine and fermented beverages from the ancient world. And I'll summarize that. I'll quickly go past my understanding. And some of you may know more about it than I do, and you're welcome to chime in case you do. Okay, so fermented beverages have been in evidence, explicit evidence for millennia. But just recently, again thinking about research in the laboratory, a Chinese dietitian has a doctorate in food and food services and chose for his research, among other things, wine. He's a teetotaler. We just thought that was a great thing to do some research on. And he decided that he would make as many contacts as he could with fellow researchers throughout the world and asked for samples of grape leaves and so forth so he could start doing a detailed DNA mapping of grapes and thus the making of wine. So it's the largest study of its kind, but it's the first, and no doubt his conclusions will get modified, amplified, and so forth. But let me just rehearse it for you very, very quickly. It turns out that the domestication of grapes goes back some 11,000 years. It used to be said that it was part of what was called the Neolithic Revolution, but now they're pushing it back 2 or 3 millennia. And that according to his DNA studies, it looks like the earliest production of wine took place in Western Asia and what he calls the Caucasus region. You'll know the term the Caucasus Mountains. But if you want to think in terms of the modern map, think of the country of Georgia and the country of Armenia as likely places for the first, at least large-scale domestication of grapes. Of course, you've got wild grapes forever, but the domestication of grapes and the unlocking of the process to make wine, fermented beverages. So that's the first thing, he said. And it looks like from his DNA mapping that the way he phrased it, virtually every modern wine-making grape in Europe, which we often think of as the center of winemaking, has a remote ancestor back to Turkey and Israel. Now, it may turn out that it'll be Syria and Lebanon in between as well, and that it looks like that the domestication and the production of wine moved east with migrating patterns. And so what took root in Europe and became world famous actually has its origins in the east. That's his conclusion. Okay, friends, that second bullet point, I'll do this quickly. And as Bill noted, I did teach him Hebrew, so I put in one Hebrew word for him and for a few others just so you recognize it. I won't ask you to pronounce it. It's okay. And that second bullet point, the general term for wine is yayin. You'll see it there in those squiggly marks, that second bullet point. And there are several adjectives that go along with it when you're reading in the biblical text. There is mixed wine and new wine and aged wine and so forth. And then there's a term, a very general term, and we know relatively little about it, called strong drink. And sometimes it's translated, this would be a fair translation, as intoxicating drink, because if you drink too much of it, you'll be intoxicated. And it may cover a pretty broad type of fermented beverages. But the Old Testament has no specific term for what we call beer or ale or mead or things like that. Probably included in that term. The New Testament uses the same basic Greek term for wine, using all your Greek sources. Oinos, it's right there also for you there. And a phrase that many of you will recognize, it comes from the New Testament for most of us about Jesus' reference at the Last Supper to drinking in the future the fruit of the vine. And it's a phrase that is used both in Judaism and in Christianity today. One of the traditional blessings that our Jewish friends use is to say, "Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, who created the fruit of the vine." It's exactly the same phrase. And so it's rooted for a long time in the culture. Okay, so that basic Greek term for wine is the basis, as a lot of our vocabulary, is the basis for several English terms associated with wine. So a connoisseur of wine, and I do not consider myself one of those, but a connoisseur of wine is an enophile. You'll recognize that term. It's based on that Greek word. Now, that second bullet point, friends, let's just face it straightforwardly as gathered here in a conversation. The biblical writers testify both to the delight and to the danger. The delight and the danger of fermented beverages. In this double assessment, they're at one with the broader culture in which they lived. That third bullet point is one some of you will know, but pretty important for us to think about for a couple of minutes together. Wine, and probably less so, but still also with beer, was consumed in a diluted fashion. It was common to go for a 50-50 or a 3-to-1. 3 parts water for 1 part wine or beer. And if you know some of your ancient classical sources, one of the Greek writers said only barbarians would drink full wine. They would drink it in a diluted fashion. Of course, the other side of that coin is they frequently drank, shall I say it this way, copious amounts of diluted wine and beer. One of these all-day kinds of things. But anyway, the typical ratios there were widely followed in the ancient world. Now, wine also had medicinal purposes. Some of you will know this. Paul advised Timothy, take a little wine for your stomach, not just the drinking of water. When the Good Samaritan treated the wounded traveler, used oil and wine in the bandaging. Now, on the negative side, may I use that term? I think it's fair. On the negative side, the biblical writers recognize the danger of drunkenness. Let's be straightforward about it, friends. With the loss of judgment and self-control, just nod your head. And the possibility that imbibing too much will cause harm to yourself or others. I think that's straightforward. One of your great passages for that is in the book of Proverbs. I've got it in bold there. Or the straightforward comment in the letter to the Ephesians. Don't get drunk with wine. Period. Drunkenness is sometimes in the cultural context and with gluttony, and they're be paired. You see, it's an overindulgence. You'll remember the famous phrase, many of you will, I'm sure, where I've got it there in Luke. It talks about the Son of Man, Jesus, who's come eating and drinking. You say, gosh, that guy is a drunkard and a glutton. Now, you may recall in that same context, they referred to John the Baptist, a well-known prophet of the period, who did not drink or did not eat bread, and they said, well, he's got a demon. You can't win. But anyway, it is the consumption of fermented beverages is often associated with gluttony if it's overdone. Okay, some other uses of wine in the Bible. Some of these you will know, and a couple of them perhaps will be new to you. So, the destructive effects of drunkenness are used metaphorically to talk about judgment. So, I've got a quote there from the book of Jeremiah. It starts about the middle point of that first bullet. Take from my hands this cup filled with the wine of my wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. When they drink it, you see what it causes. They will stagger and go mad because of the sword that I will send among them. So the judgment in the historical process that is on the horizon is likened to overindulging in wine and the negative effects that come with it. And this metaphor of the cup as a sign of judgment or a sign of something which has been assigned by providence to you or to a group of people is used several times in the Bible. Take, for example, that second bullet point. You may recognize that statement. Here you get in a little bit of context. And Jesus talking about his upcoming arrest and crucifixion as the cup that the Father has given to me. Shall I not drink it? As if he understood what was on the horizon as something that was part of God's plan for him, no matter how difficult it would be. Now that last bullet point, I wish it were July the 4th. We're close enough. But the well-known wine trough, or the vat where the grapes are trodden, is the basis of a passage in the book of Isaiah. It's a really tough passage. As my grandfather would say, it put hair on your chest when you read it. But it has to do with a kind of thoroughgoing judgment, which is the example used is the trodding of the grapes, the mashing of them down. You have it there depicted in the book of Isaiah. Remember, the battle hymn of the Republic is what I'm coming to. there with Julia Ward Howe, trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are, I won't sing, where the grapes of wrath are stored, is based on this imagery. And of course, at that time, most citizens would recognize it as such. Our current biblical illiteracy means most folks, where did that come from? Okay, wine in vineyards is a sign of blessedness. I mentioned earlier that wine and grapes were thought of, not just thought of, were staples. And so they are thought of also as hallmarks of a beneficent creation. So most celebrations had wine as a constituent element. The classic illustration you will know is that Jesus and the making of a wine. When you go and examine that passage, many of you will know, we're told that he changed the water into wine in these large stone vessels, and each of those stone vessels held lots of gallons. So it's somewhere 120 plus gallons were changed from water into wine. Now that's a real blessing for a celebration. But I think that's what it was meant to be. I mean, after all, weddings are the time when we think about the blessedness of things that God has given to us in this life. In 1 Kings, a quotation, you'll see it reflected in a couple of other places. If you have peace and blessing in the land, then that means that everybody could live under their own vines and fig trees in safety. See, that's blessedness. Or the prophets who project a time when God will bring in the kingdom in its fullness, and war and death and disease and sin are defeated. And one of those depictions that the hills of the promised land would drip sweet wine. You see, now that's a real restoration. You see that quotation there from Joel 3:18, and then in the book of Isaiah, God will host for all peoples. Well, that's a broad vision. For all peoples, a feast with rich food and well-aged wines. Now, I don't quote all of that text. That's just a lead-in to it. But it's the basis, and there are a couple of other passages which go along with it, to that wonderful hope about people coming from east and west. You know that quotation, friends? And they will sit at table with Abraham, and they'll have a feast. This is the vision of time to come is based on this depiction that God would provide a marvelous feast for everybody when death is defeated and so forth. Okay, now, abstention from fermented beverages in the Bible. For various reasons, people would abstain from the drinking of wine or beer. Some would do so, obviously, because of a negative assessment of what it can cause. But that's not it for a number of people. It has to do with discipline and a sense of culture and order. So, for example, I'll give you a reference there in the book of Jeremiah. It's pretty much a full chapter where a group of people who lived in Israel, they're called the Rechabites, they're invited to come in and have a glass of wine, knowing that they did not drink wine or fermented beverages. And it was a way to try to induce them. And Jeremiah used this as like a parable of saying, see how easily some people will give in and others will hold fast to what they think is right. And he was accusing his audience primarily of giving in too easy to what they knew was wrong. But the point was, the Rechabites didn't say, well, it's bad to drink wine. It was not part of their culture. They were from the desert steppes or the wilderness area. So you also learn that they didn't sow seed. There's nothing wrong with sowing seed. I like to eat, don't you? But they didn't do it. They acquired things by trade. And they didn't live in houses. I like to live in houses, don't you? But they didn't, because tent dwelling was their heritage, and they held fast to it for a variety of reasons, some of which we don't know. But that will give you an illustration of why some people would abstain. The second bullet point here, friends, the taking of vows. Very important in the ancient world and also in the Old and New Testaments. One of the best known will be the Nazirite vow. You'll find some aspects of it in the book of Numbers. But it's a subset of a larger category of the taking of vows, where people would bind themselves either to do or not do certain things for a period of time. We'll know that often in our culture from Lent. It's fairly widespread for a number of people to say, I won't do this during Lent. Or New Year's resolutions, I'm going to do this for whatever reason. So one of the vows you frequently see that people would abstain from the drinking of fermented beverages. Another one would be, this would not affect me much, but for the rest of you, no cutting of the hair. One of the ways you knew that somebody was under a vow is they abstained from cutting their hair. Remember the story about Samson? He said, I'll lose my strength if I cut my hair. You'll see this in various places in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we're told that Paul had made a vow on one of his missionary trips, and he had gone to the temple. This is on his, what we call the third missionary journey. He had gone to the temple to conclude that vow, and that's where the uproar came with him entering into it. And remember, he was arrested and so forth. But people would sometimes not drink wine or fermented beverages as part of a vow. Now, there's some people like John the Baptist, that third bullet point, followed a number of dietary restrictions. John the Baptist, for example, we're told not only did he not drink fermented beverages, he didn't eat bread. Do you remember there's a phrase of what he did eat? Yeah, locust and wild honey. He lived off the land. There's nothing wrong with bread. Please nod your head. He just didn't eat it. And, you know, he dressed kind of strangely, too. But he did this, you know, as a way to support other things about his lifestyle as a prophet and a preacher of repentance and new life. Okay, wine in the worship life of Israel and church. Just a few comments about this, if I may. So Israelites were encouraged, once there was a temple in Jerusalem, to go up there on a pilgrimage 2 and 3 times a year, depending on how often they could get there. They would have festival worship, Passover, and what we would now call Pentecost, or the festival of Booths in the fall, and so forth. And they would bring with them their tithes. And in agricultural society, they might have coins or other things, but they would often bring in kind. And wine and grain, as you might expect, and oil, the 3 staples, were all part of the tithing process. So people could either bring the equivalent value or the wine, the oil, and the grain itself to the temple. And when they gathered for worship, this is a very interesting quote there from Deuteronomy. If you want to celebrate, wine, strong drink, fine. If you're going to have a great celebration at the temple, do it right. In the spring of the year, there was a celebration that was called First Fruits at the temple, and one element of that was what was called a drink offering, a pouring out of the fruit of the vine, as saying thanks to God for a blessing. Drink offerings, it's an interesting term, a drink offering. It's a liquid offering, widespread in the ancient world, you know, far broader than just the biblical cultures. Our term libation is often associated with this. There were celebrations of new wine and new oil after the festival of Pentecost, and now because Pentecost itself celebrated new grain. So new wine, new oil, and grain, deeply embedded in the worship life of Israel. You'll know that third bullet point, glasses of wine had ritual and theological significance in the celebration of the Passover when people gathered in that meal. Jesus, of course, takes the cup with his disciples in the celebration with them on what we now call Maundy Thursday. Wine, of course, is traditionally served in the sacrament of the Christian Eucharist, as is grape juice. There we go. Okay, now you'll get some pictures. The Greco-Roman world, in which sits the New Testament and the growth of the early church had wine, excuse me, friends, had wine as central to its culture. And they often had wine and oil poured out on smaller altars. There were a number of altars in the ancient world which were thought of as intersection points with the divine world, about the size here of the stand. I'll show you some pictures in a moment, and they would often have incense or wine or grain placed on it. Not large enough for an animal sacrifice, but for other kinds, it would do just fine. And so here you'll see an example of the altar. That's a small altar right there, and they're pouring out some form of a libation as a part of a religious ritual, widely used in the ancient world. And so I want to call your attention, since we are in church. That second bullet point, Paul used the metaphor of a libation to portray Christian self-giving, because that would be the metaphor was something his audience would understand in Philippi. He said, even if I am poured out as a libation upon the sacrificial service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with all of you. So he took that element out of, that central element out of the culture and used it to think about commitments in the Christian life. Okay, on your left, friends, are fragments of an old wine vase. The pieces have been put back together, so if you look at it carefully, let me see if I can do this. You'll see at the top right here a grape cluster as a sign of the usage, what the vase was used for, or the jar, and there are pieces of it, you'll see them right here, and they have used modern clay around it to give you some idea of its shape. And that's a pretty old jar. So it's about 7,000 years old, the portions of it, and one of your earliest examples of a wine jar. And it comes from ancient Georgia. The capital of Georgia is Tbilisi, and the wine culture is central to that old world society. So if you're walking downtown, and I haven't done this, I took the picture off the internet. I need to tell the truth, I'm in church. But you'll see it right here. You got your grape wines going right across the street. I'm told, and I've seen some pictures and some studies, you know, if you go into some of the oldest churches, for example, if they have a cross on the wall, it may be made out of grapevines. Central, goes way, way back. Georgia and Armenia. All right, so this is not a particularly stunning picture. It shows you a working area, but note the date, friends. It's called the Arini Cave Complex in Armenia, and it dates, as you see there, to approximately 4100 BCE. So that would make it what, 6,000 or so years old. And you'll see how they have dug into the bedrock here for a basic crushing, and then they'll have a vat for fermentation over here. You would think of that as relatively crude, but I mean, okay, we're talking about millennia ago in the development of fermentation and a way to try to at least manage the process. Fermentation is a tricky process. And today, there are a number of technological ways to be quite efficient at managing it. But in the ancient world, there were lots of things that, quote, could go wrong, and sometimes did go wrong. So you would have various levels of product. Those who are experts in this say that at its best in the ancient world, the wines that were produced there are as good as the good wines today. But there will be lots of, shall I say, levels below that, where it didn't work quite the way they wanted in the process. How did they date it? That third bullet point will tell you they had grape seeds discovered. To assist in the dating of the site, you can do carbon-14 with those kinds of remains. The ceramics will give you an idea of date and so forth. Okay, the Egyptian culture, wine was very important. So you'll see in tomb paintings, some of the depictions of daily life, wine will be one of those. So as you're looking at that, friends, you'll recognize there are the grapevines right there. And once the grapes have been harvested, they're in baskets right here. And here are the jars once the fermentation process is underway or completed. You could have it in the jars, or you could have it completed and try to seal it as best you can. Right here. And you'll notice there's a scribe. You've got to have the accountants. How many bottles do I have? Where are they? Can you get one for me? So you'll have the record keeping going right there. You'll see the date on that one, about 1400, so 3,400 years ago. Here is another one. It's a different tomb, showing you again scenes in the process. And you'll see, first of all, the vines, and then your jars. You know, people often comment, let me just speak to this now as you're looking, you'll say, those jars look a bit unwieldy. Would you agree with that? That you kind of want to, I might be able to kick that over pretty easy, even if it was full. Apparently, one of the reasons you did this was that if it had sediment in it, you want it to settle to the bottom. And so when it's narrow like that, it'll go down to the bottom, and you've got more wine on the top and easier to get to, because, you see, the question is, how do I get the wine out? You have to have a dipper. Because if you've got a jar that size, it's very unwieldy to kind of, I think I'll just pick this up. Can I pour you a glass? No. No, you can't. So they had these little dippers, and they would sometimes, you'll see them, they're about this size, and they'll have a leather thong, and they're just hanging right there on the side of the jar. You take the top off, you put it in, and you pour the wine from there. But it was a way of doing settling of the sediment that might be in it. And then, of course, you see the treading of the grapes. Of course, when the grapes are cut, you're going to also have some leaves and twigs. That all gets dumped in there. Then they start working on it. And so that solid part of the must is going to be there and has to be dealt with. And that's one of the things that can be used to try to control the fermentation process. How quickly do you remove it? Do you use it again to help try to sweeten up things? But that was part of the winemaker's genius. Okay, so here is a scene from the palace of the Persian emperor. And tribute is coming in. Of course, that's the way the Persian emperor wanted everybody bringing the stuff to him. And so one of them is a horse, and one of them is a jar of wine from Armenia, one of the great centers of wine production. And not only is that going to be pretty good wine, but look at the care that must have been taken to make that wine jar. You know, that's a work of art in its own right. But bringing it in is part of tribute to the king. All right, now, someone whom you will know by name. Dionysus, or Dionysius. You hear the pronunciation both ways. The same deity in the Greco-Roman world is known as Bacchus, and you will know the term Bacchus perhaps even better than Dionysus. But widely, what term should I use? Shall I say it this way? Widely appreciated in the ancient world. Lots of depictions of Dionysus. So this one is in, it's a floor mosaic. It's in the northern part of Greece today from the town called Pella, and it's the birthplace of Alexander the Great. And you will see Dionysus here sitting on the back of the panther or the leopard with a staff in his hand and so forth. And in the ancient world, plenty of examples of Dionysus have survived, and on several occasions he's associated with the lion or the leopard. Alexander the Great was shall I say, an ardent devotee of Dionysus. Lots of celebrations with Alexander the Great of Dionysus and his gift. So here's the point, friends. In the broader Greco-Roman culture, there was a distinct deity just for wine, Dionysus. And the whole divine world sometimes participated with Dionysus. I'll show you some examples from the artwork here. So this is from a Roman villa, and each panel has some aspect of delight and parting in it. And this was the floor. This is from a place called Sepphoris, which is not too far from Nazareth, friends, but it belonged to a Gentile, a non-Jew, and because the whole house seemed to be dedicated to Dionysus having a party, they called it the Dionysus house. It was somebody's party house. Just one comment about the central panel right here, and you'll have to trust me on this. So parts of it have been eroded over time, to be expected. But this is, right here, this person is Hercules. So Hercules is depicted as getting into a drinking contest with Dionysus. Well, that's got to be a party house there. Okay, a painting from that date about 530. As you know, in classical art, they have schools and names for the famous painters, and this is one of them. So as you look at this one, friends, again, you have to use your eyes, but on different sides of this jar, so here are satyrs right there with the animal bodies and the tails, and they can get a bit rowdy from the divine world. And here's Dionysus right here, so he's got a cup of wine in his hand right there, and he's got another one right there, and this is as if he's shaking it. See it coming out? As if he's getting ready to splash it on somebody. And here are some of the satyrs right here, along with him. Now, if you look very carefully right here, somebody's playing a double reed flute. They got a little music going with the party. And that's frequently the case. You'll see music also with the work in the vats as well as in the parties to enjoy the wine afterwards. Okay, and now here's one. I'm not speaking from experience. But you'll know the term, first of all, symposium. One of Plato's famous works was called the Symposium, where you have a gathering of people for a conversation and food and drink and so forth. And there were sometimes games, as these would go on for a while, and I don't want to make light of this, but let's just say it straightforwardly. You know, sometimes people can get a bit rowdy if they've been eating and drinking most of the day and having fun. So there was a game. I will not demonstrate. It was called Katabos. You'll see it there in the second bullet point, right there. So as people were reclining, enjoying themselves, well, let me use an analogy. If you go to, say, a bar in some places, sometimes they have a game of darts. So, you're with friends, you have a drink, you have some food, some fun, so let's have a game of darts. This was a game where you put some dregs from the wine or something in the cup, and you would get back at a distance, and then they would have a target. Let's just say it's Chris over here, my good friend. And the task would be see if I could flip those dregs like this and hit the target. It's not a dart, it's wine dregs or something like that. But they would flip them. So you can see him there with his fingers just about to snap that wrist right there. Okay, a Roman sarcophagus. Someone was buried in this. You don't know that person's name. You can see there from the culture, the lines on the end right there. And here is the vat of grapes and all the little cupids or eros figures. You know, the little hanky-panky kids right here enjoying parts of it. Cupids in the wine processing. All right, here's one. Again, the issue is the culture, not to make jokes and so forth, but to understand the culture, the greater Greco-Roman culture, which the church was birthed. So here is the inscription right here in Latin, and you can read the translation. I don't have to read it for you. But somebody put that on their epitaph. I think I'll choose something else. Okay, now, back to the point that wine was understood as one example of beneficent creation, a gift of God the Creator. What you're looking at right here, friends, and there are other examples, I just chose one, it's not unique, are 4 panels from the floor of a church. The Church of St. Laud and Procopius in the country of Jordan today, and it's near the city of Madaba, and they are celebrating in this, and there are other scenes of the blessings of common life in agriculture and the changing of the seasons and the animals and so forth. We're all part of the floor of this church, but you can see there are 4 different panels here going along with various stages of collecting the wine. There's somebody there who's playing an instrument. Somebody else who's there. Then you'll see one of those turnstile presses there. They developed over a period of time. Here's somebody who's cutting and somebody who's hauling off. Now, marvelous discovery in about the last 15 years of remains of a synagogue from the 5th century of our common era. It's near the Sea of Galilee, and there are marvelous, marvelous things that were in the floor of that synagogue, mostly biblical scenes. Wonderful things to see, and I'll say to my good friend Chris right here, you know who directs that excavation, don't you? Jody Magnus from the University of North Carolina. Go Tar Heels. Yeah. Jody Magnus, she's a great, great scholar. Anyway, one of the panels in the floor of the synagogues, when they came to worship, they saw panoramas of various aspects of what we call the biblical storyline. Maybe it's the equivalent of a stained glass window. Anyway, this one has a little Hebrew quote in it right there, and it says, with a pole with 2 of them. It's a quotation from the book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 23. You may remember when in the wilderness wandering, they send the spies in to see what the promised land was like. And they went to a place, and it was called the Valley of Eshcol. And Eshcol is the Hebrew word for cluster. And they came back to show the greatness of the promised land, because they came back with a pole on their shoulder here carrying a big cluster of grapes. You can just see some of the grapes right there. So, of course, with time and circumstance, some of these are better preserved than others, but if you will trust me, and there are lots of good pictures of them, wonderful scenes from the biblical period in this synagogue. You would have been really impressed to have gone to worship there some centuries ago. Okay, again, you think about culture and how you represent yourself. In the Second Jewish Revolt against the Romans, you will probably know it as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, but it's often known as the Second Jewish Revolt. One of the things that the Jewish rebels did to try to assert their self-identity, I admire this, by the way, One of the things that they did was to take the time and effort to mint coins. Say that we're a national people too. So of all the things you might want to do in a rebel fight, it takes time and effort to mint coins. So what they would do is they would get coins and they would, I think the term from numismatics is they would restrike it. They would try to smooth it over and then they would restrike it for what they wanted. So of the things they might choose, here's one of them. So one of the leaders of this revolt was a man by the name of Simon or Shimon. And so here's his name right here, S-M-O-N, and a grape cluster they chose to represent their national identity. And a musical instrument right here, a kind of a harp. And the caption right here says, "For the freedom of Jerusalem." A grape cluster and a musical instrument. We're people too, for the freedom of Jerusalem. Okay, more pictures, friends, and I will stop in just a couple minutes. We'll take a break. 5,000 years ago, a queen from the first dynasty in Egypt was buried. She's going to need lots of stuff on her way. So one of the chambers near her burial was stacked with sealed wine jars. There they are. Now, because of time and air and sealing and so forth, none of the wine survived. But it will be in the linings of the jar, and it's fairly expensive, but it can be analyzed, and it will be. And I've got some examples of where they've gone ahead and done that. Here is from a Roman villa around the corner from Pompeii. So we know exactly when that villa came to an end. And you can see there, those look almost like sausages, don't they? How narrow they are, and hope that the sediment will collect there in the very bottom, and narrow tops, easier to seal, get a good seal if you can. So those are separated by thousands of years, but get some idea of the storage process that goes along with wine. Okay, let's see here. Now, I'm going to do a couple things. About another 10 minutes, friends, we'll take a break. Is that okay? 10 minutes, all right? Thank you. So this comes from National Geographic. They always do great stuff. And it's not uncommon at all in the archaeological world to uncover wine presses in this part of the world. Happens all the time, in fact. But here's one. It's modest in size. It's in southern Lebanon. And so you can see that they had work on the bedrock there of limestone, kind of like the hill country of Texas, limestone close to the surface. And then so this is where they would have done their pressing, if I could put it that way, and here would be the collection pool right there. So what National Geographic did, and I'm thankful for them, is they will show you various scenes in the production process here. So here comes the ancient SUVs right here. Those are the donkeys. They're quite efficient, and you can get the grapes right here, and you can put a few of the jars right here if you need to take them away. But of course, we're talking about days of process in between. But here they come, and then here is the vat right here. It has the grapes. It'll have some leaves and twigs. It'll have a musician. It'll have some rhythmic. You have times be able to hold on to your hands so you don't get disoriented. And they will start working there, and then you can see the channel as it pours out right here. And of course, some sediment will get into that. It's inevitable, even though it will have at least some screening mechanism in the drain. It will still be inevitable. And so here are your jars right here. But notice also, friends, right here you've got these plats for covering. So you could take this half and cover it up so that the fermentation process begins almost immediately. And it can go on for a few days, or it can go on for longer. And part of the issue is, do you continue the fermentation process once it's in the jar, and how do you control it or not? You always have the issue, how well can you seal a jar? And what do you use to seal the jar? For example, if you use tree resin, you want to be careful. You don't want a whole lot of tree resin in your wine. But you need something which can seal something well. But anyway, you got the various stages right here of the process illustrated for you right there in a kind of modest-sized production facility there. Okay, here's some of the amphora or the wine jars from Tel Barak right there. They put them back together. Here's one from the Galilee region, and you can see it has a much smaller entry point right here, back in here, but this was probably used for a second press. So they would take the twigs and the grapes after that first pressing and hit them again, because you could still get some wine from that. And it would drain out right here. Okay, just for comparison, friends, what you see on the left right here is an olive press. So you can see that pressing is not, I'll put it this way, it is particular to the food and to the product. So, for example, if you have olives, this is a woven basket. And you put the olives in there. This comes from a city called Hatzor, and it dates about 800 BC. And so you have your weights right here, and you press down on the olives, and it will produce olive oil, because you're not so much worried about the olive seeds. When you're dealing with wine, you don't want to crush the grape seeds. One of the interesting things about feet, you can kind of crush the grapes without being too hard on the seeds and getting them as part of the wine. Here's another way to do olive oil right here, where you could get an animal and roll around and crush the olives. Okay, here's a portable press right there. Take it with you. All right, harvest and processing right here. So grapes are typically spread out. Here's an example of what was a wild vine that has survived and now is being cultivated in Israel, called a Marawi wine. And so sometimes they use the grapes for table, for eating, and sometimes also for raisins. Raisin cakes were thought of as a delicacy, or something for fine dining occasions in ancient world, and sometimes also in worship services. And I've got a couple references there for you. What we sometimes call vinegar, what the Old Testament will call sour wine, is something in the fermentation process which wasn't controlled, or it went along too long, or whatever, and it becomes sour. But you don't want to throw it away. You want to use it. And so the use of sour wine is actually mentioned several times in the Bible. I think I've got another reference to this in a little bit. Jesus will get some of that on the cross. And I'm not being facetious here. People today, often when they're out working and they're active, they have what you and I call energy drinks. Just nod your head, right? You will have some things in it and a little caffeine for a jolt. Well, your inferior wine and your vinegar would be diluted with water, but it would be used for the same purposes because it's got calories. Calories are very important in the ancient world. So if you're out working and you need some liquid, if it's watered down, it's like 1%, but it's got calories in there. You can get it to help refresh yourself. So it was the ancient equivalent of an energy drink, quite frankly. Okay, a couple more and we'll take a short break, friends. I want to show you a large-scale wine production. This has just come up in the last few years. Now, that is the closest thing you'll see in antiquity to a factory, what we would call an industrial center today. And it's just south of Tel Aviv in a place called Yavne. And you'd think you're kind of out. I'm going to show you another picture here in just a moment, and you'll realize that you're actually right next to a city. But the way they took this picture, it'll fool you. But you get this idea of the scope. It's got a place to make the jars, a place to process and store. It was quite involved from process. See there, friends? You can tell from that previous photo, you're right next to the city. There it is. Now, during the Byzantine period, 4th through the 7th centuries approximately, AD, high production of wine in the area. This particular site is estimated to produce, they put it in gallons, 500,000 gallons in a good year. That's a lot of wine. Now, you will, of course, immediately conclude, and you would be right, that's not just for local consumption. It can be part of a pretty large trading network. I'll say more about that here in just a moment. But one of the wines that was popular from here was a white wine. Because they had red and white. And for some people, white was thought of, at least in the sources that have survived, to be a kind of premium wine. And so the fact that they could do white wine here, known throughout the empire, and it was shipped out of Gaza. Yeah, the port in Gaza. And so it was known in Latin and Greek sources as Gaza wine. That's where it came from. Gaza would be about 15 miles south of this production facility right here. Look real quick, aerial view, you can see that's quite a complex. Ground level, and so your storage and fermentation on the left, and your pressing vats there on the right, and all aspects of delivery and storage and so forth would take place right here. They made their own jars there, so they had kilns. They had, as your stopper, so you need a kind of narrow opening at the top. And there you have a stopper. Then the question was, how well can you seal it? And tree resin was one of the things that was frequently used for that process. Okay, friends, I want to stop right there. Some of you may have to run. I'm going to come back in about 10 minutes, and I intend on finishing about 11:45 if you're getting antsy. But let's take about a 10-minute break, okay? Yeah, right, Chris. Come sit under your vine and fig tree. Vine and fig tree. At the same time. Yeah, I know you're teaching, aren't you? Yeah. Yes. Every time I go over the material, I'm amazed again. Right there. Yeah. Okay, friends, just a few comments about maritime trade. As you look at the pictures up here, on the left is a reconstruction of a typical trading vessel. Nothing particularly outstanding about either the presentation of it and so forth. It was a working sailing vessel. They could be as small as about 35 feet long and as long as 100 feet or a little more, depending on their construction and so forth. Most of your maritime trade in the Mediterranean or the Red Sea would be within sight of land. So they would be out in the water, but they would still be able to see land from where they were and knew where they were. Though it is now known that the Phoenicians at least could sail by the stars, even earlier than the Greco-Roman period, because they have found a couple of deep-sea shipwrecks from that time period. But most of the time, if they were going, say, to Alexandria from Gaza, or they're going to go to Rome, or all the way up to Istanbul, or whatever, they would stay within sight of land most of the time. But it is very big business. And so what you see here in the depiction is, so your storage is down below, a little more security, a little more control of things, and you could have other kinds of passengers up here. So believe it or not, this picture comes from an aquarium in western Greece, because they discovered off the western coast of Greece one of these maritime shipping vessels that had wrecked, and all of its amphora, all of its jars were spread out on the ocean floor. Now, I'm telling the truth. They went down, the divers, got every one of those vessels, took them to the aquarium, and then re-spread them out in the water so you'd see what it looked like on the seafloor. No other comment necessary? No. Yeah, this is in the aquarium in western Greece. They took all these things off the seafloor, off the coast, when they had the wreck, and then they redistributed them just like they found them on the seafloor. So you know what it looks like on the seafloor. The contents did not survive. Okay, types of grapes and wines in antiquity. Your botanists who are trained in this have made lots of gains, and I'm going to summarize 2 or 3 things here in the next few minutes on both the grapes and the grains. Ancient wines were categorized by regions and mixtures and tastes, and less by colors, but they did have red and white wine. So, for example, you'll see that some charred grape seeds right here, and that's, of course, you see the pencil head right there, give you an idea of size. Of course, these are wonderful now for carbon-14. So they can work on these in terms of approximate dating. Okay, now, a little bit about, quite interesting to my point of view, and I hope you'll enjoy this, discovery. Many of you will remember that the Babylonians came in and besieged Jerusalem on a couple of occasions, and on a second occasion, they destroyed much of the city. It was done by Nebuchadnezzar, sometimes known as Nebuchadnezzar the Great, Nebuchadnezzar the II. And the date of that is 587 or 586 BC, so they've got it pretty well pegged. And so digging around in Jerusalem it's a congested and a contested area, as you might imagine, with all the issues that we know about today. So here are some examples of crushed wine jars that have been uncovered recently, right here. The jars held approximately 8 gallons, approximately. Okay, putting them back together. Anybody here like to do puzzles? When they get them all together, that's pretty impressive, isn't it? Okay, so a couple of comments here. You can read along on the bullet points. The rosette stamp on the right tells you that at least some of this was associated with the government, either being consumed by government officials or it's part of the taxation or storage system, but it was one of the identifying marks to go along with these. Now, that second bullet point, friends, let's just pause for a moment and look at that together. I still kind of shake my head on this one. So the chemical analysis was done by the paleobotanist in the laboratory, and so they worked on the residue. The molecular evidence is that they mixed vanilla with the wine. Now, the question next was, where did the vanilla come from? Now, this is a bit of a roll of the dice because just because we have patterns of growing vanilla plants today doesn't mean it was exactly the same in the ancient world, but the closest match they could make was Southeast Asia, which suggests, if that is the source, think of the long-distance trade involved for spices. 13,000 miles. Now, it may well be that we'll find out they imported some vanilla and they grew it nearby. Some of it grows on the east side of Africa. Who knows? But right now, that's the closest match they could make. Now, I will pause for a moment on this one to say, analyzing the residue of these broken jars is now kicking into high gear with quite sophisticated means of analysis. It's far and above my pay grade and ability to understand. You know, I can dig in the dirt, but I don't understand how those spectrometers work and so forth. So I'm going to report what I read, and if I'm wrong, somebody's welcome to correct me. But they are doing quite sophisticated analyses now. And one of the things you find out is that beers and wines were habitually mixed. As they would say in North Carolina, when I grew up, with all kinds of stuff. Now, I'm serious. Cinnamon berries, vanilla, juniper, just all kinds of things that you might not expect would be in there. And I'll show you some examples of this as we go along here. There we go. So here's the headline from a Times of Israel article. I didn't photograph the actual paper, but I copied it out. Isn't that a great line? 6th century BC Jerusalemite enophiles, there's that big word, had a taste for exotic vanilla-spiced wine. Turns out, and everybody making a big to-do about this, from 587 BC, there was vanilla-spiced wine 1,000 years earlier that they discovered recently. I'm going to show that to you. What is it about vanilla and ferment? I don't know. I mean, I like vanilla wafers. Okay, Megiddo is a site up not too far from Mount Carmel, which means it's not too far from Haifa, the third largest city in the modern state of Israel. And tombs, of course, are quite important for cultural records because if they've been sealed and not entered or robbed, then you've got, again, a snapshot in time with things to be analyzed. And so here is the tomb itself, hollowed out, and some of the storage jars that were there. And the date is approximately, it's a round number, 1600 BCE. And it also had vanilla residue in it. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that everybody drank vanilla-based wine habitually, but it does mean that it had a kind of cachet or value that when somebody important died, some of that went with them into the tomb. I think that's really the most important thing about it. So 3,600 years ago, they were mixing vanilla with wine in certain classes of people in the Eastern Mediterranean, is what this is telling us. And of course, vanilla spiced wine would not be the only thing that was in the tomb. I'll show you a couple other things just to give you an idea of what you might need on the way. You can't take right. So some of the grave goods on the right, and the picture's not, it's too faint for you at this distance. These are carved bones, quite intricately carved here on the right. And this is gold jewelry here. You might need your gold jewelry on the way. You see, no jokes here, but one of the sad things about tomb robbers is if you put valuable things in the tomb, the miscreants, the crazies, are going to try to get in there and get that stuff. Okay, we were talking about this earlier, just a few weeks ago. This comes from a Roman period tomb in Spain. And it is now being touted, so the social media has got the headlines blasting, world's oldest wine. All right, so if you go to lunch, you say, where were you this morning? Oh, I went to church. I saw the world's, okay, that's fine. Here it is. So friends, it was not for consumption. And there are several mysteries here. So as you look at this, you will see that it is in glass. So here's a pottery jar. The glass is inside of it, and it was right here. And apparently, it was very well sealed. So the tomb was undisturbed. It's cool. It's dark. A very well sealed container. And the contents survived about 1,800 years. As soon as you expose it, all kinds of things happen. And they knew that, but they did run some sophisticated tests. And one of the things they discovered, and they don't know why, so please don't ask me because I don't know the answer. It had charred human remains in it. So it's some kind of a ritual base that you've got wine and charred bones in there. I don't know if it's part of the family, what the ritual is. We don't have text to go along with which we'd like to have. We don't have those. Maybe tomorrow somebody will discover a manuscript that explains why a certain culture would do that. They did an analysis on the wine, and they said that the closest modern parallel they could find was a sherry from about 75 miles away. Still being produced today. Well, yes, it does. Okay, now I want to say a few things about beer, if I may. I'm going to do it anyway, but thank you. Really interesting question that the historians and the anthropologists ask, which came first, beer or bread production? Hard to answer that question. The two are linked and have been forever. There's evidence of the production of both in what's called the Natufian culture. That's a period between the Paleolithic period and the Neolithic period. So if you want a round date, just think 12,000 BC, okay? It's Natufian culture. So there's evidence of both baked bread and beer now moving back past the Neolithic period. It used to be the answer 20 years ago, asked on the test, when did they have the agricultural revolution, when they start doing domesticating crops and animals and this and that? Neolithic period. Now, of course, it's moving backwards. My guess is it'll keep moving backwards. In any case, in Jordan, there's evidence of baked bread from about 12,000 years ago. And the same thing for the making of beer. And it is possible, who knows for sure, that the way beer was discovered is you had some water, somebody has made some bread, they tossed some crumbs in the water, a couple of days later came back, that's not bad. Who knows, but there are plenty of recipes that go back in the earliest stages of writing saying that you could take bread and put it in warm water, and do this and that, and you would get a fermented drink from that. So bread and beer, of course, both grain-based. And what that means is that the production of beer was often located among families or extended families. And you might not have large production facilities like that big winery that I showed you just before our break. Could be done locally. Okay, here is from an Egyptian tomb painting. Now, that's a person who's drinking beer with a double straw. Now, you can imagine, friends, if you're putting grain or bread in water, you're going to have residue. So maybe quite a bit of stuff in your drink. So straws were frequently used with beer. Now, today, I don't see anybody drinking beer out of a straw. But in the ancient world, they did. So this fella here is not an Egyptian because he has a beard and his hairstyle is different and so forth, but he is drinking beer with that big, long straw. Common way to consume it at the time. Okay, so you will recognize the process. I'm oversimplifying because that's the best that my scientific mind will go. You've got the grains, different kinds of grains. It could be wheat, emmer, so forth, barley. They're heated in water to create sugars, calories. And loaves of bread could be thrown in, yeast could be added, and what it meant was, especially in the early times, what you and I would think of as porridge or gruel, and certain kinds of beer would have similar consistencies. So the question would be, what kind of containers do you have for heating? The production of beer is earlier than pottery. So you have to ask yourself, what kind of vessels could you use if you don't have any pottery to hold it? Well, it would be stone depressions and things like that, which I'll show you here in just a moment. Okay, grains used for beer, strong drink, and vinegar. Emmer is a grain that is less used today in our culture, but it was fairly popular in the ancient world for the making of beer. And so you'll see some emmer grains there in that hand. Barley, at least in the eastern Mediterranean, was the most popular grain used to make beer. It was low cost, and it was also your low cost option for bread. It comes up earlier, you may know, in the growing season. So you harvest barley as early as March in a good year. Wheat will be into latest April, May, and June. And when barley and wheat are done, our Jewish friends would celebrate Pentecost, because that's the first part of the harvest, and you got your grains in and so forth. Okay, a few comments about quality and consumption. It's a big question among the experts. What range of qualities would these ancient productions result with? The answer seems to be that at their best in the ancient world, they could equal good wine today. But there would have been quite a bit of slippage along the way because of all the variables in production. But when it worked quite well. It seems to be the conclusion of the experts. I mentioned this earlier, that second bullet point about sour wine and vinegar, from medicinal usage to caloric intake. That little reference there in Ruth. Remember that great story about Ruth? She's a Moabite woman, and she goes during the grain harvest, she's out working, to get enough so that she and her mother-in-law can have something to eat. And she's going along, and Boaz, who owns the field, says to her, now, please go ahead and have some of that sour wine. You can dip your bread into it. So they had a jar of vinegar or sour wine, or low quality, but it had calories. It's the energy drink. Now, a more serious matter, friends, that reference in John when Jesus is suffering on the cross. There was a jar of sour wine or vinegar nearby, and they put some on a sponge to give him. In Roman society, daily consumption of wine was the norm, and that ran through the society. Our Jewish friends include wine production today, and there are dietary codes that they follow. Many of you know practicing Jews, observant Jews, and so there are the standards. You would call the general term kosher. So you will see the term kosher wine. That means that it was produced according to a certain kind of standards. But they go back centuries, and the issue was because wine was used in pagan rituals of various kinds, you didn't want any crossover. So to make sure that didn't happen, you had these procedures to follow so that you would not be involved, even inadvertently, in idolatry. So that's what the kosher signs are designed to watch over the process. Now that last bullet point, friends, a big sea change in the production of grapes and wine and fermentation of beer and so forth with the Islamic waves that came through, because, as you know, the consumption of fermented beverages is forbidden in Islam. And so the production facilities kind of withered away. They allowed Christians and Jews and other people to continue to grow grapes and to ferment beverages and so forth, but it took shall I say it, not just a back seat, but a third seat in the culture over the centuries. Okay, you're looking at a few depressions in the floor of a cave. Don't get all excited. That's literally what you're looking at. However, it is the oldest surviving example or known example of beer production in the world. Now, this is before pottery. So you ask yourself, what did they keep the liquid in? Yeah, who said it? Holes in the ground. So that's what these are right here, basic for mixing and so forth. This is the Rakefet cave. It's near Haifa. And you see the date there. So here's Mount Carmel Range right here. Haifa's located there, and here's the cave. So you can see they stirred the beverage right there. The vessels they used there are carved out of stone. And they published this picture with the article in the scientific journal, so I thought, I'm going to show it. I don't know what I'm showing. But I can give you the headline that is accurate. The molecules identified with the process in the laboratory, they're labeled, and I mean, it's quite sophisticated. Really quite impressive. Okay, now here's a brewing project I hope will interest you. The British Museum, 2018, they took some recipes that are written from the Egyptians. Got the date there. They took some recipes also from a Sumerian hymn. That would be considerably earlier. That would be like 4,000 years or more ago. And they decided we're going to try to run several iterations of the beer. Just see how it turns out. And go along with the comment from earlier, it's clear from these increasingly sophisticated analyses that mixture was common, various things in there. So they did that too. That first bullet point right there, the one that everybody liked the best, had dates as part of the fermentation process put in with the beer. Okay, I'll give you another example. Just I don't show a picture, but a tomb in Turkey dating about 700 had a barley-based beer. It had mead, grape wine, and saffron. Now, that gives new meaning to me for the word mixed drink. Probably a funeral drink. Okay, so here's the recipe. Now, friends, you probably can't see it, but listed on there, it's called Iteration 1, Iteration 2, Iteration 3. That's what it says right here. It's probably just a little too far if you see, but it also gives you the alcohol content. Several of you have been asking that question. And so right here is iteration 3. It's the one that had the dates in it that said it had the smoothest taste. And it says 4.8%. Here's another one with 5.1%. So different recipes, different styles, and they did it in the lab, controlled conditions. Come back to things in a moment. So an excavation team has been digging at the Israeli site, a place called Tel Es Safi. It's also known as Gath from the Old Testament. Gath is the word for press. Because that's what they did there. They pressed stuff. And it's the home of Goliath. And several pottery vessels there from about 1000 BC, so approximately 3,000 years ago. And they also checked the residue, found out that they've got beer and mead, that means fermented honey, water and yeast. And so they identified the yeast on the wall. And I hope I have this right, and if I have it wrong, Lord, forgive me. But I think I have this close to being right. They say that the yeast is a colony, a surviving colony of the yeast from 1000 BC. It's not 1000 BC yeast, but it's yeast that has grown as a colony over the years in that dark area, undisturbed for 3,000 years. So they took that colony as part of, to use the yeast to make the drink. That's the point. Nod your head. That's great stuff, isn't it? All right. Okay, some of the vessels that had the yeast residue. So we've talked before about sometimes you can get elements in the beverage. So here's a strainer right there. So once it gets into that, you can pour from there. It might catch a few things, so you can see the strainer right there. This is your typical Philistine pottery. You can tell automatically from the decorations, some of the seeds that came from it. These are the vessels that were used to get the colony of the yeast. And all jokes aside, I think I have that right. I hope I do. Okay, so they started the fermentation process. You'll see in the background here, those are the vessels that they used in the scraping process. The finished product brings a smile to your face. The end. Can we pour something for you? So, for friends, thanks for coming. I promised I'd be done at 11:45. It's 11:45. You can get up and run to places that you need to be. But if you do have questions, I'll be glad to entertain a few of them. But anyway, thanks for coming. Nice to see you. It has to do with trying to know thoroughly an ancient culture. I'm interested in oil. I'm interested in wheat. I'm interested in wine because it was central to the culture.
When they would bring the drink libations that they bring to the temple, would that be wine they would pour into larger vats for the use for the priest?
No, those would be brought in vessels.
Yeah.
Then they would have a goblet they would pour out. Remember, the altar is the intersection point between heaven and earth, and they would pour it out there as offering. It would just go into the dirt or on top of the altar.
So it wouldn't be preserved?
No, but they would preserve. They had lots of wine and wheat and oil stored around the temple.
Yeah.
It could be consumed by the priest and so forth.
But I mean, that's brought then.
Brought the, yeah, it's part of your tithe.
Part of the tithe.
Yeah. You would tithe your wine just like you would. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Don't waste the whole lot.
Yes, ma'am.
What town in Spain are they doing all that?
I can send you the information. I do not recall.
Okay.
It's in southwestern Spain.
Southwest.
If you call me or remind me, because I have the article that tells about it, and I'll be glad to share it. I'll send a PDF or something to you. Ben, yes, sir. Probably so. A simplistic partial answer is that your desert culture doesn't have as much experience with it, and so maybe their first encounters can be negative. But in some sense, their prohibition of it is like some of your dietary laws in the Old Testament. It's a way to serve God as they understand it. You don't always have to have a rational reason. It's just this is what we do to be holy and so forth. Okay, friends, nice to see everybody. Thanks for coming out.